weekend, got another game today, so we hope that he comes through unscathed, and we expect him back on the training ground Friday. Our preparation has been one of positive.
Colin Todd spent his career doing the impossible. 2 First Division titles with Derby County, an England career built on reading attackers before they'd even decided what to do. He was composed, intelligent, and very hard to beat. But 5 men genuinely made him lose sleep. 5 opponents who tested everything he had, who pushed him to the edge of what a defender could physically and mentally do. This isn't a list of famous names. It's a confession from one of England's finest, looking back at the golden generation of football and admitting, honestly, who actually broke through his composure. I am Oliver, and this is Sport Icons. There's a version of Jimmy Greaves that lives in statistics. 357 First Division goals, top scorer in 6 different seasons, the most natural finisher English football has ever produced. But if you ask Colin Todd what made Greaves so difficult, the numbers aren't where he starts. It was something harder to measure than goals. Greaves didn't look like he was trying. That was the problem. While defenders around the league were being battered, out-muscled, or outrun, Greaves was doing something quieter and far more unsettling. He drifted. He ghosted into spaces that hadn't existed a second earlier. By the time a defender registered his run, Greaves was already set, already balanced, already deciding where to put the ball. Todd faced him during the Tottenham years, when Greaves was operating at the peak of his powers. The movement inside the box was already the stuff of legend among defenders, and Todd would have known that walking into every match against him. Knowing didn't help. That's the thing about Greaves that separated him from every other striker of the era. You could watch him, study him, prepare for him, and still find yourself watching the ball roll into the net, wondering how he'd arrived there before you. Most strikers give a defender something to work with. There's a shoulder drop, a shift of weight, a moment where their intention becomes readable. Greaves gave you nothing. He never seemed to sprint, never seemed to strain, and he didn't rely on brute force to create separation. The movement was so clean, so unhurried, that it looked almost accidental until the ball was in the back of the net. Todd has reflected that you simply couldn't bully Greaves. Physical defending, the kind that won Todd championships at Derby, didn't register as a threat. Greaves absorbed contact without losing his balance and found a way to still get his shot away. You couldn't outthink him either, because his decisions came faster than any defender's attempt to anticipate them. The only real strategy, Todd admitted, was hoping Greaves was having an off day. Most days, he wasn't. What made this particularly difficult was that Greaves operated without ego in the traditional sense. He wasn't trying to humiliate defenders the way some attackers did. He wasn't interested in the battle of personalities. He simply wanted the ball in the net, and he found a way to put it there with an efficiency that felt almost indifferent to the difficulty of what he was doing. A goal wasn't a moment of triumph for Greaves. It was just the inevitable conclusion of a move he'd already seen 3 seconds before anyone else. For Todd, facing Greaves was a lesson in the limits of preparation. You could be fit, focused, tactically sharp, and still come off the pitch having been made to look slow by a man who never appeared to break into a full run. That quiet, relentless precision was the thing Todd carried with him long after those matches were over. Greaves was impossible to read. The next man on this list was impossible to stop, even when you knew exactly what he was going to do. Denis Law didn't want to beat you quietly. That was the first thing you noticed. Where Greaves made defending feel like chasing a shadow, Law made it feel like a fight. A deliberate, personal, sustained fight that he intended to win on every single occasion. He was wired differently to almost every other attacker Todd faced. The talent was obvious, but it was the aggression underneath the talent that made him genuinely dangerous in a way defenders found hard to prepare for. Physically, Law shouldn't have dominated the way he did. He wasn't built like a traditional centre-forward. He didn't have the height or the frame that defenders used as a reference point when organising at set pieces or crosses. But that frame was deceptive, and defenders who judged him on it paid for it almost immediately. Law won aerial duels against men who had every physical advantage over him. The timing was extraordinary, the leap seemingly disconnected from what his body should have been capable of. He'd rise above defenders who had no business being beaten in the air and get there first, every time. Todd has spoken about Law's hunger for friction. Other attackers preferred smooth passages of play, liked the game to flow in their direction. Law wanted the contest. He wanted defenders to know he was there. If you tried to bully him, he pushed back harder. If you gave him space, he punished you before you'd even registered the mistake. There was no comfortable middle ground when you were marking him, because he'd already decided there wasn't one. He fed off the discomfort he created in defenders and used their uncertainty as fuel. The technical side of his game was where Todd's praise became most specific. Law's eye for goal in tight spaces was something defenders couldn't account for with positional discipline alone. He found angles that shouldn't have existed, instinctive volleys, flick-ons that redirected crosses into the net, the snapshots taken before a defender could close him down. These weren't rehearsed moves. They came from somewhere reactive, somewhere deep in his instincts that functioned faster than conscious thought. You couldn't prepare for a decision he hadn't made yet. The combination of that aggression and that technique created a particular kind of problem. If you matched his physicality, his technique punished the space the contact left. If you dropped off, the aggression meant he'd press that advantage immediately. Every approach handed him something to exploit. What Todd carried away from those encounters was an awareness of what pure competitive drive looks like, alongside genuine quality. Some attackers were ferocious, but limited. Some were gifted but manageable once you'd settled them physically. Law combined both at a level where neither cancelled the other out. The aggression sharpened the technique rather than blunting it. You left a match against Dennis Law feeling like you'd been in a war, not because of anything brutal, but because he demanded everything you had for 90 minutes and still found moments to remind you it wasn't enough. Law made every game a battle. The next man made every game feel like you were chasing a ghost. If Jimmy Greaves made you feel slow and Dennis Law made you feel beaten, George Best made you feel foolish. That was the distinction. It wasn't just that he got past you, it was the way he did it, the complete absence of hesitation, the almost casual manner in which he left defenders standing in positions they hadn't intended to be in. Other attackers exploited mistakes. Best manufactured them out of nothing, from situations where a defender had done everything right and still ended up watching him accelerate away. Todd faced him during the late 1960s and into the early 1970s, when Best was in his mid-20s and everything about his game was functioning at a level most footballers never approach. People rearranged their weekends around the possibility of seeing him do something they'd never seen before. That pressure would have worn most players down to something cautious and diminished. Best absorbed it and performed anyway. The technical problem he posed was genuinely unsolvable. Best could go either way with equal conviction. Most wingers have a preferred direction, a lean, a subtle tell that experienced defenders learn over time. Todd was exactly that kind of defender. Intelligent, observant, the type who built a picture of opponents' habits. With Best, that picture kept changing. The lean meant nothing. The drop of the shoulder could precede a move in either direction or neither. You committed to one side and he was already on the other. Not because he'd reacted to you, because he'd already decided before you moved. He didn't just beat defenders, he made their instincts work against them. What Todd has spoken about, and what sets this apart from the challenges posed by Greaves or Law, was the psychological dimension specific to facing Best. There was a quality in him that enjoyed the public nature of the contest. 60,000 people watching, and Best was entirely comfortable being the center of that attention. Comfortable putting a defender in an impossible position in front of all of them. He didn't embarrass defenders out of cruelty. It was simply that he was fully switched on when the stage was largest, and the best version of Best came out precisely when the pressure was highest. That's a rare thing. Most people contract under that weight. He expanded. Todd's respect for Best carries a particular kind of weight when you understand what it means for a defender to say someone was genuinely unfair. Todd built his career on discipline, positioning, and composure. He won championships by making difficult things look manageable. Calling Best unfair isn't an excuse. It's an acknowledgement that there are levels of talent where the normal rules of defending simply stop applying. Best operated at one of those levels consistently, for years, in the biggest matches, against the best defenders the country could produce. That's why the name still comes up first when people from Todd's era talk about the players they simply couldn't find an answer for. Best was the most gifted. The next man was the most complete. Bobby Charlton presented a completely different kind of problem. With Greaves, the difficulty was invisibility. With Law, it was relentlessness. With Best, it was unpredictability so refined it functioned like a weapon. Charlton's challenge was none of those things individually. It was all of them operating through a single player who had turned football intelligence into something that made physical defending almost beside the point. He wasn't a dribbler in the best mould. He didn't seek out one-on-one situations and thrive on the personal contest the way Law did. Charlton's game worked on a different register entirely. The threat came from his movement without the ball and from the sheer weight of his shooting, which defenders respected from distances that most players would never have considered worth attempting. You couldn't sit deep against him because he'd find the pocket of space in front of your defensive line and strike from there before you'd closed the angle. You couldn't push high because the space behind you became exactly what he wanted. Charlton's ability to arrive late into areas, timing his runs so he received the ball already moving toward goal, meant every defensive shape left some gap he could identify and use. Todd has spoken about the intelligence dimension specifically. Most attackers react to what's in front of them. Charlton seemed to be working from a picture of what the game would look like 3 moves ahead. He'd drift into an area that seemed covered, stand there while the play developed, and then the space opened exactly where he'd predicted. By then, he was already set, already committed. Ball arrived, and so did the shot, before a defender had time to process that the situation had changed. You can't press or tackle your way out of that kind of foresight. There's also the weight of what he carried onto the pitch. World Cup winner, European Cup winner, a survivor of Munich. Charlton didn't buckle under expectation. He'd already proved that, in the most extreme circumstances the game could produce. Walking out against Derby County, he brought that history with him, and it seemed to settle him rather than burden him. What separated Charlton from the others on this list, in Todd's framing, was that he made you feel the gap in your own understanding of the game. Greaves made you feel slow. Law made you feel physically outmatched, despite his size. Best made you feel like your instincts had betrayed you. Charlton made you feel like you hadn't thought hard enough. Like there was a version of the game being played that you could see but hadn't fully grasped. That's a particular kind of difficult to sit with after a match. You could explain away pace, or aerial ability, or trickery. You couldn't easily explain being outthought. Charlton was the most intelligent Englishman Todd faced. The final name on this list wasn't English at all, and he may have been the greatest of them all. Johan Cruyff is the name on this list that sits slightly apart from the others. Greaves, Law, Best, Charlton. Todd faced those men repeatedly, across seasons, in the rhythms of the First Division. Cruyff was different. The encounters were rarer, the context different, but the impression he left was the one that lasted longest. That's worth pausing on, not the most frequent opponent, but the one Todd still talks about with a particular kind of stillness, like someone recalling something they're not sure they fully understood even now. What Cruyff did wasn't what the others did. He didn't ghost into spaces like Greaves, didn't impose himself physically like Law, didn't wrong-foot you with his body like Best, didn't outthink you from 30 yards like Charlton. What Cruyff did was play a different game, not a better version of the same game everyone else was playing. Structurally different one, where his understanding of space, time and position meant he was operating from a set of rules that the defenders around him hadn't been given. Todd's era was built on physical defending. You won your duel, you held your shape, you made life uncomfortable for attackers, and eventually, they made a mistake. That approach worked against almost everyone. Against Cruyff, it was irrelevant, because he was never where contact was possible. He moved before pressure arrived. He vacated space before a defender closed it. Physical contests that Todd had spent his career mastering simply never materialized, because Cruyff had already relocated to somewhere the defensive structure hadn't accounted for. The Cruyff turn is what most people remember, and it's a reasonable shorthand for something larger. That move didn't just beat a defender, it announced something. Everything your instincts told you was about to happen could be reversed entirely, and that the reversal was already planned before you'd even committed. For a defender whose entire game was built on reading opponents and acting on those reads, facing someone who could neutralize that instinct completely was something genuinely new. What Todd took from those encounters wasn't frustration, it was a shift in how he thought about defending itself. The others on this list tested him. Cruyff changed something in how he understood the game. That's a different category of opponent, and Todd has been honest enough to place him there without qualification. 5 names, 5 entirely different problems, and that's what makes this list something beyond a simple ranking of talent. Each of these men exposed a different limitation, asked a different question, demanded a different response. Todd answered well enough to win championships, to earn England caps, to build a career that stood up against the finest generation world football has produced. But he's never pretended the answers came easily. What you're left with, looking at those 5 names together, is a picture of an era that the game hasn't fully seen since. Todd faced them at their peak and kept winning. That's the real measure of how good he actually was. Drop a comment below telling us which of the 5 you think was the toughest opponent of that generation, and subscribe if you want more stories like this one.